A Spanish elderly couple vanished on a sunny road trip through California. 7 years later, their skeletons were found jammed inside an RV buried beneath a desert sinkhole. What was parked beside it rewrote everything the police believed. It was supposed to be their last big trip. Antonio and Maricel Delgado, both in their early 70s, had been married for nearly 50 years. They'd raised 2 children in Madrid, run a small grocery store together, and spent most of their retirement enjoying simple pleasures: coffee on the terrace, gardening, and the occasional family dinner with their grandchildren. But for years, Antonio had dreamed of taking Maricel on an American road trip, from the coastlines of California through the desert's parks, the national wonders he'd read about in his travel magazines. In March 2016, they finally booked it. A 3-week RV tour through California. It was all prepaid. A mid-sized rental RV, complete with a kitchenette and solar panels, awaited them at a pickup lot in Los Angeles. Their itinerary was modest: Joshua Tree, Death Valley, Sequoia, and then on toward San Francisco. They planned to drive slowly, stop often, and enjoy every moment. Their daughter Carmen had been nervous. She lived in Valencia and called her parents every day. "You're not young anymore," she had told them in Spanish. "Just promise me you'll check in every day," Antonio had promised. The first week went beautifully. Maricel sent pictures of blooming desert flowers, dusty sunrises, and smiling selfies outside every park sign. They made friends at campsites, swapped recipes with fellow travelers, and even tried s'mores for the first time. Their last known stop was a small gas station near the Mojave Desert, just outside a place called New Dale Junction. It was the final photo ever sent to their family, both smiling in the sun, holding a paper map, the RV parked behind them. The timestamp, March 13th, 2016, then nothing. The next day, no call. Waited, then 2 days. She assumed a lack of signal. But by the 3rd day, with no photos, no texts, and no answer from either of their phones, she contacted Interpol. A missing persons alert was filed, and within a week, it became an international case. Local authorities in San Bernardino County launched a search. The RV rental agency confirmed the couple had picked up the vehicle and left on time. Surveillance cameras at the gas station confirmed they were last seen there, both in good spirits. The footage showed them leaving the station and turning off the main road onto a dusty side route, marked only by a faded sign: Scorpion Flats Trail, Scenic Loop. But that scenic loop wasn't on most maps. Within 2 weeks, search crews were combing the desert with helicopters and drones. Volunteers and rangers covered hundreds of square miles on foot, but there were no signs of the couple. No tire tracks, no debris, no cell phone pings. Even the RV had seemingly vanished into the dust. With temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, hope began to fade. By the end of April 2016, authorities quietly shifted the case to a cold file. No evidence. A foul play? No signs of a crash or struggle, just 2 names on a list of thousands. Missing travelers lost in the American Southwest. Carmen, however, refused to let it go. Over the years, she returned to California several times, meeting with desert search teams, private investigators, and even psychics. Nothing worked. Her last trip was in 2020. That time, she brought her son Diego, who was 18 by then. They lit candles near the Joshua Tree Park border and left a laminated photo of Antonio and Maricel by a trail sign. That was the last effort. Until 2023, in July of that year. A construction company working on a highway expansion near the old Scorpion Flats Trail discovered something during an excavation project. They had been operating heavy machinery near a dried-out arroyo, a wash that hadn't seen water in years. When one of the bulldozers sank slightly into the ground, the soil had given way beneath it, and what lay underneath wasn't just loose. DIRT, an RV. Rusty, buried almost entirely beneath compacted desert earth. The workers immediately called the sheriff's department when they noticed something else: a human arm. Shriveled and gray, sticking out of a shattered passenger side window. The discovery was headline news. Within hours, yellow tape surrounded the scene. Forensic teams arrived, and beneath layers of dried clay, The sun-bleached logo of the rental company was still barely visible on the side of the vehicle. Sunbeam RV Rentals. It matched the description of the Delgados' missing RV exactly. But that wasn't all. Inside the RV, authorities found two skeletal bodies in the back cabin area. Both were seated upright, seatbelts still fastened, and the clothing matched the outfits seen in the final gas station photo. Take weeks, but the initial identification was considered near certain. Antonio and Maricel Delgado had been found 7 years later. But one detail changed everything. Only one of the bodies had skeletal trauma. The other showed signs of post-mortem relocation. From that moment, it was no longer just a case of two. Tourists lost in the desert became a homicide investigation. News of the discovery spread quickly, both in California and overseas in Spain. Carmen Delgado received a call from the Spanish consulate in Los Angeles before sunrise. She had just opened her eyes when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. From the moment she answered, the world shifted. "The RV has been found," the voice on the other end said carefully, almost gently. "I'm so sorry." Carmen didn't cry right away. She just sat up in bed, staring at nothing. Her husband, Jose, walked in moments later to find her clutching the blanket, unmoving, whispering her parents' names under her breath. In California, the scene became a media frenzy. Reporters lined up behind yellow police tape as investigators cordoned off the sinkhole and began the slow process of pulling the RV from the earth. It took 2 days to fully extract the vehicle. Rust had eaten away at the frame, and years of sediment had caked over every surface. Inside, heat and time had preserved very little. But what remained was unmistakable. 2 decomposed bodies, both still buckled into the back lounge seats. The air was dry, the interior eerily undisturbed. One wore a pale floral blouse. The other, a sun-bleached button-down shirt and khaki pants. Sheriff Ryan Medford, the lead on the reopened case, gave a brief press conference. "We believe these are the remains of Antonio and Maricel Delgado." Spanish nationals reported missing in 2016. The vehicle was found roughly 12 miles off the main road in an unregistered section of land near Scorpion Flats Trail, an area not clearly mapped in state databases. But he didn't tell the public everything. Behind the scenes, there were questions, deep ones. Dr. Naomi Keller, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the case, noticed inconsistencies. The male victim, likely Antonio, has fractures to the orbital bone and jaw that appear perimortem. Consistent with blunt force trauma, she explained. The female, Maricel, shows no such signs. Her bones are intact, suggesting either natural death or post-mortem relocation. This meant one of them might have been attacked, while the other might have died in another location, and someone might have placed them together afterward. But who and why had the RV gone completely undetected for 7 years? Local maps didn't even show a dip in the ground where the sinkhole had formed. The land was dry, flat, and devoid of major trails. Yet somehow, an entire RV had ended up there, as if the earth itself had swallowed it. Sheriff Medford quietly reopened all files from the original 2016 investigation. His team reviewed satellite data, weather reports, and missing persons bulletins from that time. One name kept resurfacing: Doug Finley. In 2016, Doug had worked as a part-time tour guide and backroad mechanic. He lived off-grid in infrastructure. Mobile home near Newdale Junction, the very last place the Delgados had been seen alive. He'd also been questioned during the original disappearance but was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Medford paid him a visit. Doug was now in his late 50s, sunburned, gaunt, with a permanent squint from decades in the sun. His trailer hadn't changed much. Beer cans littered the porch, and a faded flag hung limp by the doorway. "We're reopening the Delgado case," Medford said, cutting to the point. Doug raised an eyebrow. "You found them?" Medford didn't answer. He just watched Doug's hands, how they fidgeted, how he scratched the back of his neck a little too fast. Doug sighed and stepped out onto the porch. "Look, man, I told you all back then. I saw them. No, they asked for directions to Scorpion Flats, said they wanted a scenic drive. I pointed them down the old trail, the one past the creek. But That trail wasn't listed on any maps, Medford said. Doug shrugged. Locals knew it was safe enough if the rains hadn't come. He trailed off. Medford caught that. What rains? Doug didn't answer right away. It was a freak storm 3 days after they passed through. Flash flood filled the washes. Maybe that's what buried them. But the sheriff wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, Carmen and Diego arrived in California for the first time in years. They were escorted to the county coroner's office, where they were allowed to view the personal effects recovered from the RV. Marisel's necklace. Antonio's cracked glasses, a journal water-damaged but legible in places. Carmen turned its pages slowly, stopping at one dated March 13, 2016, the last entry. We met a man near the fuel stop who offered us a shortcut to the next trail. Kind fellow, very tan, bit quiet but helpful. He showed us a side route through the valley. We're parked near the edge of a dry creek now. It's so quiet here. I think we'll sleep well tonight. What? It was signed Marcel. Carmen's hand shook. She looked up at the detective beside her. This man, do you know who he was? The name wasn't written, but Carmen's voice quivered as she whispered, I think he lured them there. Hey. Investigators now had circumstantial evidence linking Doug Finley to the site, but nothing concrete. No DNA, no fingerprints. After 7 years, most of the forensic trail was cold. Still, questions piled up. Why was only one of them injured? Why were they both belted into the back, not the front of the RV? And how had the vehicle gone missing for so long without anyone noticing? Sheriff Medford requested a geological survey of the land surrounding the discovery site. The answer was surprising. In April 2016, a minor seismic event. A 3.2 magnitude quake had occurred near the Scorpion Flats region. It hadn't caused any structural damage, but it had triggered surface shifts in loosely packed soil. Experts now believe that the RV parked near the dry arroyo had been partially buried during the storm. Then, when the tremor hit, the weakened earth collapsed fully, sealing the vehicle underground like a coffin. It had been invisible from above. The desert, it seemed, had swallowed its secret until now. Yet something still didn't fit. Why had Antonio been hurt? Why had no one, not even Doug Finley, ever reported seeing the RV again, even after it vanished? And most unsettling of all, what had happened inside that vehicle in the hours before they disappeared from the world? The sun had just dipped behind the desert ridge, casting long golden shadows across the dry basin. When forensic teams began their second inspection inside the RV, the first round had focused on skeletal remains and obvious artifacts, clothing, ID, and that water-damaged journal. But now, with the vehicle lifted and stabilized on a tarp-covered excavation platform, Sheriff Medford gave them a different order. Start fresh. Treat this like a new crime scene. Look for what we missed. Inside, they removed every loose panel, floorboard, and wall segment still intact. There wasn't much left that hadn't been warped by time, heat, or sediment. Still, something caught one of the intern's eyes, a cracked corner behind the kitchenette's small fridge. The intern shined a light into the narrow crevice and reached carefully with gloved fingers. Out came a small, flattened object, charred and curled at the corners, with faint letters in Spanish a receipt. It was for 2 bottled waters, an apple, and a fuel top-off. Time-stamped March 13th, 2016, 12:04 p.m., from a station in Newdale Junction. The receipt matched the timeline Marisel's journal described. But what stood out was the back, a scribbled note in rushed ballpoint pen. Doug. 15 miles trail cut past tank. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was enough to confront him again. That evening, Carmen and Diego sat quietly at a local diner in 29 Palms, their meals untouched. A photograph of their parents, smiling beside the RV, lay face up on the table between them. Carmen stared at it, her eyes red and swollen. I think she was scared, she whispered suddenly. Diego looked up. Who? Mom. The way she ended that journal entry, it didn't feel right. She was always careful. She wouldn't have trusted a stranger with a backroad shortcut unless she felt safe. Or maybe she was trying to convince herself she was. Diego's throat tightened. Do you think they knew something was wrong? Carmen nodded, but by the time they realized it was too late. The next morning, Medford returned to Doug Finley's trailer with the receipt in hand. Doug looked rougher than before, stubble unshaved, eyes rimmed red. "You never said anything about writing them directions," Medford said, holding out the slip. Doug squinted at it. "Don't remember writing that." "It's your handwriting," Medford pressed. Doug looked away. "We know they made it to the fuel stop," Medford continued. "We also know you were working part-time there that week. The journal says you gave them directions. And now we've got this with your name and route tucked away in their RV. Start talking, Doug." Silence. Then Doug exhaled sharply. "I didn't kill nobody. That's not what I asked." Doug leaned on the porch railing, staring at the sun-baked dirt. They were old, lost, thought they'd save time taking a back road. "I told them it was a bad idea. Flash flood came. I never saw them again." "But that's not what you said. In 2016, you told deputies you never spoke to them at all." Doug didn't answer. "Why the lie, Doug?" Still silence. Meanwhile, deeper in the lab, Dr. Naomi Keller was poring over newly enhanced digital reconstructions of the remains. What she found next added a chilling layer. Marisol's left femur had thin, hairline scratches, shallow but deliberate. Under magnification, the pattern repeated. Thin, parallel cuts, just deep enough to etch the bone. They weren't random. They looked like tally marks, 28 of them. "These marks aren't from decomposition," she explained. "They were made before death, possibly by her or someone else." 28 days, Medford repeated quietly. 28. That's how long someone may have survived. "In that RV," Keller said. "So they didn't die at the same time?" "Likely." "Which one lasted longer?" Keller hesitated. "Based on position and bone density, it may have been her." The thought of Marisol trapped in that buried RV for nearly a month, possibly alone after Antonio had died, sent a chill through the room. "But that means someone could have returned after," Medford said, thinking aloud. "Placed them together, moved them, or even tried to cover it up. It also meant the burial might not have been entirely accidental. Carmen and Diego requested to visit the site where the RV had been discovered. They were escorted by 2 deputies and a forensic photographer who walked them along the excavation path. The sinkhole, now sealed off, lay quiet beneath an orange tarp. But just beyond it, Carmen noticed something strange. About 30 feet away, behind a low ridge, a rusted pipe jutted out of the ground, clearly man-made. Carmen pointed. "What's that?" "That?" One of the deputies shrugged. "Could have been part of the old mining drainage system. This area had prospectors back in the 30s. Carmen walked toward it slowly. At its base, she saw shattered glass, the remnants of a bottle, and what looked like the corner of a blue plastic tarp, half buried. "Did you check this?" The deputy stepped forward, alarmed. Within an hour, ground teams returned with equipment. Under the shallow sand, they found discarded items, an old walkie-talkie, a worn shoe, women's size 7, a partial camping chair frame, and beneath it all, a shovel with dried blood still flaking from the rusted edge. Suddenly, the theory that nature had swallowed the RV seemed less certain. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This had all the makings of a cover-up. For the first time, Medford ordered a complete reinvestigation into the original search effort. From 2016, dozens of interview transcripts were re-reviewed, helicopter flight paths were cross-checked, and a troubling inconsistency emerged. On March 16, 2016, 3 days after the Delgados vanished, a park ranger named Ellis Carter logged a report of a foul smell near Scorpion Creek. But the area was marked cleared in the official response log without evidence of an actual search. Medford located Carter, who had since retired and moved to northern Arizona. "Why didn't you press the issue back then?" he asked the retired ranger. "I did," Carter replied. "But the area wasn't on the jurisdiction map. It was technically outside the state-monitored section, private land on an old survey map. My boss said it wasn't our problem." Medford's stomach twisted. "Had we gone then," Carter said, "maybe we'd have found them alive. But someone had made sure that didn't happen. By the end of the week, the evidence began to point in a different direction, not just to Doug Finley, but potentially to someone who'd helped him. Someone who knew the land, someone who knew how to erase a presence from the desert. And, most crucially, someone who had access to areas the public didn't. The photograph had sat untouched for nearly 7 years in an old external hard drive, buried under hundreds of field files from geology students who had once surveyed the Mojave Basin for a university soil erosion project. No one had thought to cross-reference academic research trips with the Delgado disappearance until a retired professor named Leo Madsen contacted the San Bernardino Sheriff's Department after hearing about the RV discovery on the local news. He remembered a student named Asha Patelquia, Sirius, always carrying her Nikon with a high zoom lens. In March 2016, Shah had been on a solo assignment collecting images of ridge fault lines near an old gas station where the Delgados were last seen. "I think she might have snapped something," Madsen had said. "She was always photographing. Anything odd in the terrain?" The hard drive he mailed in was slow and dusty, the kind that clicked loudly when it spun. But buried in a folder labeled desert_rocks_2016_Aja, the investigation team found dozens of landscape photos. Sweeping. Sand ridges, rock veins, dry creeks, and then they found it. A wide shot of the distant desert, zoomed at 300 millimeters. Dated March 13, 2016, at 2:48 p.m., far in the background. At the edge of a low ridge, a white RV sat parked at an odd angle, almost hidden in a dip. The driver's door was open. To the right, barely visible but enhanced by AI scaling, stood a man wearing a ranger shirt. But the badge and name tag didn't match any current employee in the 2016 database. The location in the image was roughly 2.5 miles from the sinkhole site. The timestamp placed the RV hours after the gas station visit and just before the Delgados went silent. Sheriff Medford's team began hunting through old rosters, focusing on temporary hires, contractors, or anyone with off-grid land access. One name quietly rose to the top: Rhett Calloway, a part-time contractor formerly employed for brush clearing and fence work in remote parcels of land leased by the county. He had been fired in 2017 after complaints of harassment and unapproved use of service vehicles and, crucially, he was a known associate of Doug Finley. Meanwhile, Carmen and Diego Delgado were back in their hotel room, surrounded by manila folders, printed maps, and decades-old land surveys. They had become investigators in their own right, driven not by duty, but by a sleepless need to know the truth. "I don't think this was random," Carmen said, pointing to a printout. "Area where the RV ended up, it's not even accessible without knowing the terrain." Diego agreed. Someone led them there. That wasn't a detour. It was a setup. He paused, then opened a folder marked Property Transfers 2015 to 2017. "I found something," he said. A single document showed a 3-acre stretch of land, mostly dry wash and bad land terrain, sold in early 2016 by a shell company named Jasper Creek Holdings. The buyer, a man named Rhett Calloway. Sheriff Medford wasted no time. By the next morning, a multi-agency task force had permission to search Calloway's current residence, a dilapidated house near Landers, California, about 30 minutes northeast of the last known location of the RV. Inside, the house was a mess. Dust coated nearly every surface, and empty beer cans were piled like cairns across the kitchen floor. But what caught Medford's attention was the locked metal cabinet in the back room. When they forced it open, they found a faded Ranger uniform shirt, to the same style and tone seen in the 2016 photo, several old CB radios, a 1896 California survey map marked with red X symbols, one of which aligned almost perfectly with the RV sinkhole, and a camcorder, old, taped together, with a mini DV cassette inside. They didn't watch it right away. It had to be carefully transferred to digital without risking damage. But even the label gave Medford pause. March 16th, wash trail. Later that evening, Medford sat in the evidence room watching the footage play on a secured terminal. There was no audio. The camera seemed damaged, but the visuals were clear enough. The frame opened shakily, held by someone walking behind brush, zooming into a white RV stopped on a trail. Then it cut to closer footage, filmed from behind a rock. Antonio Delgado stood outside the vehicle, looking around. He walked a few steps toward the camera's direction, confused but not alarmed, possibly trying to get a signal. Then another figure entered the frame, a man, average height, late 40s, pale, wearing that same ranger shirt. He held a clipboard and pointed to the right, as if giving directions. Maricel appeared in the doorway, hesitant. The video cut again, this time with the RV doors closed. Finally, the last shot. The camera panned to a deep, narrow trench, where the earth looked recently disturbed, and a freshly used shovel leaned against a rock. Medford froze the footage. This wasn't someone who stumbled across a lost couple. This was someone who watched them, recorded them, and likely led them to their deaths. Back at the station, Carmen and Diego were shown the video privately.
Carmen
Trembled as she watched her father's final moments, his confusion, his effort to stay calm. Diego stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. They both knew what had happened. Their parents were lured. This wasn't a robbery. There were no signs of looting, no missing valuables. This was about control. Someone wanted them out of the way. But why? And was it truly just a random predator, or was something more elaborate at play? Then came a chilling update. While reviewing satellite maps from early 2016, investigators found a faint tire track pattern. It's only visible under rare erosion conditions, leading to an adjacent wash area, approximately 600 yards from the sinkhole. Teams went to the location. There, they discovered an old rusted generator, some spent propane tanks, and an improvised tarp shelter. Beneath it, preserved by the dry air, were pages from a spiral-bound notebook. The notes weren't detailed, mostly sketches, supply lists, strange phrases. One phrase repeated, "People don't matter. Places hide better than lies." The writing matched samples from Rhett Calloway's employment forms. Suddenly, Medford realized this wasn't just a one-time event. This was part of something practiced, calculated. He looked at the evidence wall back at headquarters and noticed. How many missing persons cases from the same 2-year stretch shared something subtle? They all vanished near unmaintained desert. Trails, areas where Calloway had worked, and where Doug Finley once marked shortcut routes for tourists. Now everything was shifting. The Delgados may have been random only in selection, not in circumstance. Rhett Calloway wasn't just a name from a faded file anymore. He was the shadow that moved between search grids, the face behind false uniforms, the predator hiding beneath bureaucracy and sand. But the hunt wouldn't go as anyone expected. In the dim morning light of late November, the desert air stung with a cold that contradicted its sunburnt landscape. Sheriff Medford's team assembled near the brushland north of Landers, armed with maps, photos, and one singular goal: find Rhett Calloway if he was still alive. The break had come from an unexpected source. An anonymous tip, a crackling voicemail left at 2:13 a.m. on the station line. "I saw the man you're looking for. He's not gone. Lives out past Silver Bell Canyon, aimed right in the head. Keeps to the canyons. It's been there since summer. No callback number, no name, but the voice was older, raspy. Sounding like someone local, Silver Bell Canyon was vast. It's not even properly mapped on most digital charts, a mix of dry stream beds, abandoned mining camps, and narrow rock formations. If someone wanted to disappear there, they easily could. And it explained everything. Why no one had found the Delgados sooner. Why Rhett's trail had gone cold. He hadn't run far. He'd just burrowed deeper. The team brought in drones, infrared sweepers, and satellite imaging. But it was boots on the ground that found the first sign. A length of barbed wire twisted into a makeshift perimeter fence, partly buried by time and dust. Beyond it, a narrow path of flattened soil curved around a rock wall and vanished behind a scrim of old juniper trees. Detective Lee Ramos spotted the footprints first. One set, heavy-worn boots with a distinctive crack near the toe, the same sole pattern found near the sinkhole months earlier. Ramos motioned for silence, then drew her radio to whisper coordinates, moving into visual range. There's a shelter. What they found didn't look like a house or even a cabin. It looked like a buried shipping container, partially excavated. With camouflage netting draped over its top, solar panels, some broken, others still sun-facing, were rigged to a crude battery system. Animal bones were scattered in the brush. An oil drum had been converted into a water heater. There was no movement. They waited, then approached. The door, steel and sealed with a padlock, showed recent use dust, disturbed, handles gripped. Often but no one answered the knocks. They cut the lock. The container's interior reeked of rust and mildew. Dust motes swirled in the flashlight beams. On the far side, in a chair bolted to the wall, sat a man with a long gray beard and empty, sunken eyes, as if time had hollowed him from the inside. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just nodded once when asked, "Are you Rhett Calloway?" Back at headquarters, the news rippled fast. They had him, but he wasn't what they expected. Rhett was underweight, dehydrated, exhibiting signs of early dementia and intense paranoia. He babbled in fragments about shadows, betrayal, people who shouldn't ask questions, and, most of all, maps. "I showed him the maps," he muttered once during intake. "Wanted the whole place, said the holes were perfect." "Who?" Medford pressed, but Rhett just laughed. "The guy with the truck. Promised me the names would stay gone." The puzzle was shifting again. This wasn't just about Rhett anymore. This pointed to a second figure, someone orchestrating, using Rhett like a guide. When Rhett's backpack was searched, they found what finally cracked the rest of the case. A torn receipt from Desert Supply Hardware, dated March 10th, 2016, for bulk rope, tarpaulin, and industrial sealant. Signed not by Rhett, but by Doug Finley, the missing park ranger. The man presumed dead in a house fire. Medford stared at the signature like it had insulted him personally. It wasn't just forged. It matched the exact handwriting on tourist logs from 2016. Logs previously assumed to be Rhett's. Doug wasn't dead, or at least he hadn't been then. Now it made sense. Doug had orchestrated the false trails, used Rhett to manipulate terrain. Maps, when the Delgados drove through Charming Curious, denied they became convenient targets. But the final piece didn't fall until a second anonymous tip came in. This time via email, with the subject line, "Look in the well." The message contained a GPS pin deep in a closed-off portion of Joshua Tree Park territory. Terrain so remote it hadn't been patrolled in over a decade. The area had once been an off-grid ranch in the 1970s, used for backcountry tourism, abandoned for years. Now it was just empty land owned by the Bureau of Land Management, but the GPS point was specific. An old well, capped with steel, hidden behind sagebrush and partially buried. Inside it, beneath rust and metal sheets and covered with an old tire, was a sealed plastic drum, heavy molded shut. They cut it open at the station. Inside were two passport-sized photos of Antonio and Maricel Delgado.
Hey.
Both smiling, a folded map with a hand-drawn route leading to the sinkhole site, and a voice recorder. It clicked on with static.
Ow.
Then a voice. Tired, worn, unmistakable. "If you're hearing this, I'm not around anymore. My name's Doug Finley, and I didn't mean for any of this to go the way it did." The confession lasted for minutes. Doug admitted to orchestrating a few disappearances, mostly of people he deemed too nosy or reckless in restricted zones. He spoke like he was doing the park a favor, protecting the land from outsiders who didn't respect it. The Delgados specifically but described a Spanish couple who asked too many questions at the gas station and a white RV that wouldn't stay en route. He claimed Rhett helped him dig and prep the trench, and then Doug vanished into the terrain. "No one will find me," the tape ended. "Not until they learn how to look between maps. It's not until they see that land hides things better than any man ever could." Rhett didn't last long after that. A heart attack took him in custody less than a week later. But before he died, he said one last thing to Detective Ramos. He said, "I wasn't the last." Said people forget easy in the desert, that the land forgives what the law won't see. Carmen and Diego stood at the sinkhole again, this time behind caution tape, watching as evidence crews documented the final dig. The ground no longer whispered mystery. It told the story of manipulated trust, of quiet terrain turned into a trap, and of two people, their parents, whose lives were stolen by loneliness and power, twisted into something dark. In the next part, the final truths would come to light, and the desert would speak one last time. The public didn't know the full story yet, but rumors were starting to leak about an ex-ranger, a recluse in the desert, and a sealed voice recording. That might explain a years-old disappearance. By the first week of December, news vans had started parking outside the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. Producers called the department non-stop. Online forums spun theories wilder than anything the detectives had encountered. But inside the precinct, there was no time for headlines. Detective Ellie Ramos sat alone in the darkened audio lab, listening to Doug Finley's voice over and over again, every pause, every change in tone, every word. The former ranger had clearly gone rogue, but his motivations still felt murky. He claimed to be protecting the park, the land, but from what? Curious travelers? Families like the Delgados? Why had he involved Rhett? More importantly, where had he gone? 'Cause if he hadn't died in that house fire, as the evidence now suggested, then he'd had 7 years to cover his tracks, 7 years to disappear. But people like Doug didn't vanish without leaving a trail. You just had to learn where to look. That's what led Ellie back to the land management archives in Barstow, where dusty maps, handwritten ranger logs, and retired patrol reports from the 90s and early 2000s were kept. She wasn't looking for Doug. She was looking for his pattern, eventually buried beneath a weathered 2003 field log. She found it, a reference to a remote ranger outpost known as Station Delta 9, not listed on any current maps but used during wildfire surveillance 20 years ago. Delta 9 had been Doug's assigned post, and it sat just 6 miles northeast of the well where the confession tape had been found. Ellie wasted no time. She assembled a small team and headed out the next morning. The terrain was brutal, no marked trails. The SUV had to stop 2 miles out, forcing them to hike the rest. But then, through the heat shimmer, the silhouette appeared. A weather-beaten shack, tilted, abandoned, but not untouched. The team approached carefully. One of the windows was boarded from the inside. The front door hung half open. Inside, maps, dozens of them, all annotated by hand with symbols, markings. Notes like Watch 317s and Van Spot 412ths. Old photos were tacked to the walls, blurry zooms of hikers, families, even children, all taken from a distance. Doug had been watching people for years. There was no sign of him in the shack, but someone had been there recently. A lantern was warm. Pot on a rusted stove still held traces of soup. He was close. Back at headquarters, they ran the photos through old database logs. One image stood out. A 2019 photograph of a man and woman, tourists from Sweden, whose camper had been vandalized during their visit. At the time, no one thought much of it. But Doug had noted the photo, stayed too long, left the trail. Suddenly, the scope of his actions felt wider. He wasn't just targeting people who asked questions. He was targeting anyone who disrupted his view of the land control, territory, paranoia, disguised as stewardship. Doug hadn't been a protector of the park. He'd become its self-appointed warden. The next break came not from maps or logs, but from a man named Jerry Roth, a retired rockhound who'd lived off-grid near New Dale Mine. He showed up at the sheriff's office with a brown envelope and a story. Back in 2017, he said, a guy passed through my camp, said he was a ranger. Wanted to trade jerky for batteries, told me not to hike south of Pinto Wash, called it a ghost zone. I thought he was nuts. Inside the envelope was a hand-drawn map with red X's. One of the X's was exactly where the sinkhole was found, the spot where the Delgados had vanished. Another was marked Palisade Gulch, a place not even listed on most topographic surveys. That's where he said he buried. The boundary, Jerry said? No one knew what that meant, but Ramos and her team were already packing gear to find out. Palisade Gulch turned out to be a jagged canyon mouth hidden behind a false ridge camouflaged by rock slides and brush, only visible from one angle. Would have taken someone years to memorize the land that well. At the bottom of the gulch, a sealed mine shaft entrance, bolted steel, decades old or so it appeared. But one of the bolts was fake, a sliding mechanism, hidden access. They opened it. The smell of earth and rust rushed out. The mine was dry, narrow, winding. Half a mile in, they found it. A room dug out by hand. In the center, a cot, a wood stove, and along the back wall, a stack of journals. Ramos opened the top one. August 2020, the Spanish couple wouldn't stop looking. Asked too much about the sinkhole, I warned Rhett. Told him not to take their side. He's cracking. Talking too much. Further entries referenced movement at the old Coyote Basin, the development of ghost spots on maps, and a chilling line from November 2021. I'll be a legend once it's done. People will walk right past my world and never know I'm watching. No signature. Just the initials DF. The Delgados weren't an accident. Doug had manipulated maps, witnesses, even the local landscape. When the couple poked too hard, he orchestrated their disappearance, then staged the fire to fake his own death. He'd lived in the wilderness for 7 years, hiding in plain sight, sometimes mere miles from hikers and rangers.
Ow.
Doug wasn't just a criminal. He was a phantom, a ghost of the land he once swore to protect. When Carmen and Diego Delgado were finally told the full truth, they sat in silence. The two stood again at the edge of the sinkhole, this time under full sun. "There's peace in knowing," Carmen whispered. "But I wonder if Mom and Dad ever saw it coming. If they knew in those final moments that it wasn't just an accident, that someone chose this for them." Diego didn't answer. He just looked down into the earth. They hadn't found the bodies yet, but they were close. Very close. The morning. They found the bone. The sky was unnervingly clear. The search team had returned to the sinkhole site with new instructions. After uncovering Doug Finley's hidden journal cache in the mine and decoding his patterns, Ramos was certain the Delgados' remains were still nearby, not scattered by wildlife, not lost to erosion, but deliberately hidden somewhere just out of view. It was the youngest member of the team, Officer Grant, who noticed it first. A smooth, curved object protruding from the lower edge of a dried flood channel just southeast of the sinkhole. He thought it was a tree root until he brushed away the soil. "Ma'am," he called. "You'll want to see this?" Ramos crouched next to him, heart thudding. It was unmistakable, a human radius bone, nearly intact. It hadn't been there during the last scan, which meant heavy rains that swept the region 2 weeks prior had shifted the sediment. Unearthing the edge of a burial site, they brought in forensic archaeologists. By the second day, the excavation revealed what no one wanted to say aloud until it was confirmed: 2 human bodies. One male, one female, positioned side by side beneath 3 feet of compacted desert earth and stones. Their clothing still clung in patches to their skeletons. The wedding rings were the first obvious clue, but it was the waterproof watch, still ticking faintly on the woman's wrist, etched on the back with Carmen CMRE, that confirmed it. The Delgados had finally been found, but the mystery was far from over. The bodies showed signs of blunt force trauma, injuries consistent with being struck at close range. Likely with a metal object or animal activity, no natural rockfall. This was intentional. The timeline, supported by insect activity trapped in the soil layers, put the date of death somewhere between August 17th and August 20th, 2016. That aligned exactly with the last known footage of the couple. But the question still loomed. Why bury them just 100 yards from the sinkhole where their rental car had been found? Why not farther away? Why not deeper? Unless Doug wanted them found eventually. He wanted someone to uncover this message. Inside the mine journals, another disturbing entry had surfaced, written in December 2016. "My months after the couple's disappearance, rain has slowed. Ground too soft. They're still close to the car." Poetic circle complete. It confirmed what Ramos feared. Doug hadn't just been hiding the Delgados. He was curating their memory, staging it like a warped tribute to the land he thought they were threatening. But something else in the entries chilled her. Several pages mentioned Rhett, the sinkhole witness, and one mentioned that Rhett had tried to warn someone. "Told me he left a note," Doug wrote. "He said he dropped it somewhere near the rental. I looked. I never found it," which meant There might be one last clue still out there. Ramos and her team returned to the site, this time with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar focused on the vicinity of the buried car. After hours of scanning, Officer Grant's detector pinged. Just beneath a layer of clay soil and quartz gravel, they unearthed a small dented tin box, no bigger than a deck of cards. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a single folded piece of paper, soaked but legible, written in trembling cursive. "To anyone who finds this, I can't live with it anymore." Doug told me they were a threat. I didn't ask questions, but I saw him that night. I saw what he did. They were kind people. They just asked the wrong question at the wrong time. This note makes it to someone. Please tell their son and daughter the truth. I'm sorry, Rhett. Ramos froze. This was it, not just circumstantial evidence, not just theory. This was a direct witness confession, and it sealed Doug's fate. Back in Barstow, Diego and Carmen Delgado sat quietly in a windowless room, staring at the paper. Neither spoke for a long time. When Carmen finally broke the silence, her voice was hoarse. They were alone out there, surrounded by sand and silence, and they still tried to find answers. They didn't just vanish. They were hunted. Ramos nodded solemnly. "I know this doesn't bring them back," she said, "but it gives them dignity. It gives you a truth that was stolen." Diego stood. "Now what?" Ramos exhaled. "We hunt him." The official narrative, the one known publicly, was that Doug Finley died in the 2016 cabin fire. His remains had never been definitively confirmed, but no one questioned it until now. With Rhett's note, the journals, and the location of the bodies, the department reclassified the case. Doug Finley was declared alive and a fugitive. The FBI was brought in. His photo, aged and digitally rendered, was circulated across national databases. Someone recognized him. A ranger from Nevada's Amargosa Valley reported a man who matched Doug's appearance living near a wildland reserve under a different name, Harvey Tillman. He worked odd jobs, lived in a trailer off-grid, and had recently vanished after someone mentioned Joshua Tree in passing. But he'd left behind a bag. Inside, a journal, maps, notes on sightings, and a photograph clipped to the last page of photo of a middle-aged Diego Delgado speaking at a press conference. A red circle around his face, and a note below it. "He's getting too close." Return to finish. Ramos's blood ran cold. This wasn't over. Doug was still watching. Back in California, they increased security around the Delgado siblings. A special task force was created to monitor desert entry points, abandoned ranger posts, and off-grid supply routes. But the truth was clear. Doug Finley had survived 7 years in isolation once. He could do it again unless they caught him first, and they had no idea where he'd go next. 2 lanterns glowed by the temporary memorial set up at the site. The desert was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a pause, a moment between horror and closure. The ground had finally given up its secret, but the ghost that buried it was still out there. And he knew they were coming. The desert had quieted down since the news broke. For 7 years, the story of the Delgados' disappearance had remained a mystery. Murmured only in old travel blogs, family-run Facebook pages, and on the lips of desperate relatives. But now, with national coverage sparked by the skeletal discovery and the leaked journal entries, the case had turned from quiet sorrow to public outcry. And it brought pressure on Ramos, pressure on the Barstow Sheriff's Office, pressure on everyone who had once believed the case was unsolvable. Carmen and Diego were now in constant protection. A rotating team from the department ensured they were never left alone. Carmen still had nightmares, waking in cold sweats, convinced her parents were calling her from beneath the sand. Diego, on the other hand, hadn't spoken a full sentence. In days, he just kept looking at maps, over and over again, trying to find him. In the meantime, Ramos and her team focused on tracing Doug Finley's movements. They pulled old utility records, searched wilderness checkpoints, dug into financial data from before his death. Something didn't add up. Doug had owned property in 3 states, California, Nevada, and Utah, all in arid, remote areas, with minimal population. But one piece of land, purchased in 2014, under the name BF Excavation Company, hadn't been mentioned in his earlier journal entries. It was in southern Utah, not far from the Arizona border. The land had no registered buildings, no tax filings. But satellite imagery from the past few years showed solar panels, a water tank, and what looked like a camouflaged shelter built into a hillside. "Bingo," Ramos whispered. They assembled a team and got federal permission to investigate. But when they arrived, it was empty. It was empty. Long empty. Dust coated every surface. Supplies were missing. The water tank had been drained, solar panels damaged from wind. The most chilling detail, scrawled on a back wall in faded black marker, read, "The truths buried deeper than bones." Below it was a drawing of a twisted Joshua tree, its roots wrapped around a skull. Doug had been here, but he was long. Ganon's still watching. Back in Barstow, Carmen received a strange envelope. It had no return address. The postmark was blurred. Inside, a single photograph, her and Diego standing outside the memorial site 2 weeks ago, clearly taken with a long lens camera from a distance. On the back, in small handwriting, "You should have stayed quiet. There's more desert out there than you'll ever search." It changed everything. This wasn't just history anymore. This was a threat. With FBI support, Ramos requested drone surveillance over the sinkhole and surrounding regions again, this time with infrared and ground-penetrating radar. It was Officer Grant, once again, who spotted something. On the northern ridge above the original sinkhole, hidden under brush and natural rock formations, was a sealed drainage tunnel, long forgotten by the Park Service. According to old maps, it was part of a 1960s stormwater system that had never been fully completed. The team hiked up the ridge that evening, and what they found stunned them. The tunnel had a rusted iron gate, but someone had broken it open. Long ago. Inside were scratched words on the wall. "You don't know what's buried here." 30 feet in, sealed behind a collapsed section, they found a locked metal cabinet buried in the dirt. It was sealed tight, almost like a vault. When they forced it open, they discovered a box of old camcorder tapes, dates labeled in black ink. August 16th, 17, 18, 2016, and one other word scribbled across the front of the box. "Visitors." Ramos froze. The FBI took the tapes in immediately. It took days to clean and digitize the footage, but when they finally watched it, there they were, Antonio and Maricel Delgado, smiling, laughing, walking toward the edge of a ridge, completely unaware that someone was filming them from behind. The rocks? The videos continued for several hours across 2 tapes, showing the couple setting up camp, eating sandwiches, reading from a trail guide. Then, on the final tape, there was movement. The camera shook slightly, then refocused. Showed Doug, unmistakable from the earlier photos, walking slowly into their line of vision. He waved. The Delgados waved back, never saw the metal rod behind his back. The tape ended just before the first strike. There was silence in the FBI screening room. One agent wept, another turned away. Ramos sat motionless. The videos weren't just evidence. They were a horror film, a reminder of how quickly trust can become terror. With the final proof secured, the case exploded. Doug Finley was now the most wanted man in the American Southwest. Interpol was notified, checkpoints established, rewards offered, but he was still nowhere. It was as if he'd vanished into the earth again. Ramos had a theory. He's already somewhere new, already buried another name, another identity. But he can't help himself. He watches his work. He follows the reactions. So they set a trap. The department leaked a false report, claiming the Delgados' adult children were planning to build a permanent memorial near the site, a large one. Public with a plaque describing what Doug had done. They said it would be unveiled on a specific date. Privately, the memorial was never being built. It was bait, and it worked. On the morning of the fake event, hikers spotted movement on the distant ridge, someone in desert camo watching through binoculars. They radioed the team. The man tried to flee when he realized he'd been seen, but he tripped on a slope, tumbled down a rocky path, and broke his leg. They surrounded him. He didn't speak a word, but he didn't have to. His face told the story. It was Doug Finley, a Leva ghost, finally caught. He was extradited to California, held without bail, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted intimidation of witnesses, and interference with a federal investigation. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "They didn't belong here." It was the last sentence he ever spoke publicly. The courtroom was full. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder, sketch artists flicking their pencils across rough paper, and cameras stationed just outside, capturing every angle of the trial that had taken 7 years to arrive. Carmen Delgado sat quietly behind the prosecution, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, a rosary wound between her fingers. Diego sat beside her, eyes straight ahead, as if afraid that blinking might somehow undo all of this. Their parents. Images had been shown repeatedly throughout the week. Framed photos, laughing vacation clips, stills from the horrifying camcorder footage. Doug Finley remained expressionless through it all, even as the prosecutor called him a predator. Even as the jury flinched at the audio snippets from the recovered tapes, even when the term premeditated was used. He didn't blink when the court heard he had stalked other couples in the months before 2016. He didn't react when Ramos testified. It was only when Carmen spoke during the victim impact statement that his face changed. "My parents believed in kindness," she said. "They offered food to strangers. They let cars merge on the freeway. They taught me to look people in the eye, even when they look away first. They trusted this country. They trusted its open spaces. They trusted a smile from a man in the desert. And for that, they died." Doug shifted then, just slightly. His lips tightened. His jaw moved. For the first time in the entire trial, he felt something not guilt, but annoyance. And that sealed it for the jury. Guilty on all counts. Life in prison, no parole. But the story didn't end in the courtroom, because while the case had technically closed, there was still the question of why. Why this couple? Why this location? Why the elaborate burial in the RV's hidden compartment? Why the sealed tunnel with the tapes? Why had Doug Finley, 4 years before this, maintained a string of identities without ever committing any known crimes? FBI analysts pored over his journals, his maps, his saved data, backup drives, burner phones, even notebooks recovered from his last hideout. Patterns emerged. Doug had believed in something, a theory, a system, an obsession. He called it the Sanctuary Project. According to his notes, Doug believed that tourism was poisoning sacred land. Places where the dead speak beneath the stone, as he often wrote. He targeted areas where tourists had started to wander too freely, photographing too much, sharing GPS coordinates of off-trail wonders. He saw the Delgados, cheerful and talkative, as representatives of that global intrusion, documented their habits for 2 days before striking. Even more chilling, he had a list of other names with photos, and notes beside each. Some were crossed out. Others were still clear. No bodies had been found for those names, not yet. Meanwhile, the Delgados were finally laid to rest. Carmen and Diego chose to bury them in a peaceful cemetery outside San Diego, where the ocean breeze reached the headstones, and hummingbirds flitted between lavender bushes. They didn't want a giant memorial, no news crews, no viral hashtags, just peace. Just the truth. As the dust settled, Ramos returned to the sinkhole one last time. She walked the rim quietly, listening to the wind whip across the open earth, carrying heat and silence together. The place looked the same as it had that first day, but everything had changed. She thought about what Doug had written on that tunnel wall. "You don't know what's buried here?" Now she did. It wasn't just the Delgados' bodies. It was the lie that people like Doug Finley could walk among others unnoticed, hidden. Beneath charm and a campervan smile, it was the illusion that evil always looked like evil. Sometimes it looked like your neighbor, or the guy who waves as he passes, or the man who offers to help with your tent pegs. 3 weeks later, Carmen received a final envelope. No return address, postmark smudged again, but this time, no photos, just one sentence. "For every hole you fill, the desert makes another." She handed it straight to the FBI, and she didn't lose sleep. Not anymore, because she decided something. She wouldn't live afraid. Her parents wouldn't want that. They'd smiled until the end, and now she would too. A week after the trial, Carmen sat in her parents' favorite garden. The ocean breeze was light that morning, brushing past the tiny wind chimes they'd hung years ago, still clinking, still singing. She didn't bring flowers, just silence. There were no more questions to ask. Doug Finley was behind bars. The tapes were locked in evidence. The desert had been searched thoroughly, and the old sinkhole site had been sealed, filled in with earth and stone. There would be no more falling. But Carmen knew something that the world wouldn't see in courtrooms or headlines, that evil doesn't always live loudly. Sometimes it walks quietly, eats at your table, nods at you on the street, waves from the trailhead. Doug had been that quiet kind, the kind that doesn't chase, just waits. He hadn't killed out of chaos. He killed out of twisted belief. And her parents had simply been in the wrong place with open hearts. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's voice, thick with accent, always saying there is beauty even in broken places. She understood that now, not because it was poetic, but because, even in the shadow of tragedy, they had found truth. They had found them, and they had buried them properly. That mattered. Diego didn't speak much after the trial, not on camera, not online, not even in interviews. He returned to Madrid with his wife and son, choosing a quieter life. But before he left California, he wrote a note for the Park Service: protect the places that cannot speak. Because the ones who once stood there no longer can. They framed it in Joshua Tree Park's visitor center. Tourists still came, but now more of them asked why some trails were closed, why certain areas were marked off limits, why there were no benches at one of the pullouts. Some learned, some didn't, but for the Delgados, it was enough. Their story had been told, and they were no longer just gone. They were remembered for who they were, not how they died.